So I'm Blayne Welsh. I'm a Welsh man, and I am the son of a member of the Stolen Generation. My journey to research, like the river, was winding. During my 20s, I was involved, as a lot of our young fellas are, in a drug scene, and that all came to a culmination a bit over 10 years ago, in my late 20s, and I moved down to Melbourne. And I was recommended by my cousin to go to the Steiner seminar and do their program. It might be healing for me. And while I was there, I ended up playing Lysander in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we were doing drama activities. And the amount and capacity for drama to heal was really apparent to me. It was such a healing force for me doing that, so I decided to follow that along with the question that I've always had in my mind since I was much younger, which is, how can I serve my mob? How can I help the mob? And I saw so much capacity in drama for doing so. So I went to uni thinking that I would, become a drama teacher. I can go back out to Canamble, work in a high school, but I sort of realised I wanted to go further than that. And that led me to here and now, and the work that I'm doing. That's a big question, obviously, and I'm midway through, so it still has room to form and shape. But largely what my PhD looks at and explores, and it's a reflection of my own personal story and exploration, is understanding what the underlying philosophies are that my ancestors held, and the way that that is put into praxis and practice. So the device I use, I call the ancestor. So the ancestor is a construct. I've created a literary construct that allows me to, in a little bit more deeper way, think, what would it have been like to be a person seeking knowledge in a world that the concept of text doesn't even exist, where you have your body and your embodied presence in relationship to the living space around you, and how those processes and how some of the activities we used to do, specifically in the PhD around theatre, or around the performative practices, how those performative practices also serve the purpose of being research tools and methodologies, as well as being tools to, articulate, to heal. So my PhD is trying to find, my PhD dissertation is going to be really about finding those connections in practice in a way that I can employ and put into practice through my own work. So when I started my PhD, the first thing I wanted to do was recreate the men's initiation ritual, the Welsh men's initiation ritual. I feel that would have been, and I still am going to seek to do that, because one thing that kicked off this investigation process is there was pictures taken in the 1890s of my ancestors initiating young men. And being that I come from a place of disconnection around identity, I recognised how important a ritual and a ceremony like that can be to secure identity. That rather than having to go through a process of, as we always do, who's your mob, what's your last name, where you're from, it can just be a simple gesture or a word or a sentiment that would only be known by somebody else who's been initiated, and instantly you've got that connection. I thought that'd be a really valuable tool, but what I came to realise as I was approaching it is that that's a big job, and that's a journey not just for me, and I don't have that authority. So like with many researchers, we narrowed the scope, and I was trying to work out, okay, what ritual practice can I use my contemporary theatre skills to try to revitalise? And I had met Joe Salvatore at NYU when I was on an Aurora study tour. and he runs the Verbatim Performance Lab. But what actually got us what connected us and caused us to have a lovely long conversation was talking about ritual. He was also interested in ritual. So the Fulbright came along. I actually didn't really anticipate or plan to go to New York. The head of Aurora called me and asked me if I wanted to apply for the American Australian Association scholarship and maybe go over for 6 months, maybe find something to do. So I did that, and he also put me into the Fulbright, so I applied for the Fulbright, and lo and behold, I got both of them. So I went over there to work with Joe at the Verbatim Performance Lab, and when I encountered verbatim performance, and particularly Joe's practice, which is so care focused, the care for the spoken word, care for the original speaker, and care for the text, moving forward in time, I felt like I was just watching, I was watching a blackfella work with that. So you had that same ethics and consideration around it. And immediately I also made those connections to Bungaree and the Grand Corroboree and the way he was described as a person who could just mimic people so precisely. And that made me draw again these connections back to thinking about the ancestor and asking, why Bungaree? Why are you doing this? Why is this mimicry? What's the purpose that it serves? And I started to say, yeah, that's a verbatim research and performance practice. By embodying the white fellas and the governors the way it did, it's a way of understanding. It's a way of building empathy, and a way of trying to seek to establish connection and dialogue in the context of the white fellas' environment, which for the settler, as you mentioned, back then we were the objects of study. It was a peculiar artefact, but for me now, looking back at it with this lens, I see that there's so much more that was going on, not just there, but the corroboree, the reasons for doing the performances. I started seeing drama therapy in there. So it was that connection of verbatim performance, and particularly through Joe's work, that I recognised that yes, this is the practice I can focus on. I can focus on trying to revitalise our oral tradition in a way that works in our contemporary world, and that hopefully future generations can pass on the practice I'm developing, and we can revitalise our own culture in our own way. Yeah. So verbatim performance, as the Verbatim Performance Lab defines it, is the precise portrayal of an actual person, word for word, gesture for gesture. So you're seeking to replicate the speech patterns and the gestural patterns. Now I'm mainly focusing on speech patterns in my work, but also gestural patterns. In the context of VPL and how it's used over there, it's actually in itself a research methodology. So for example, something that we were working on with Joe is looking at bias. So bias in politics. So what we can do, for example, in Her Opponent, Joe restaged the debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, but swapped genders. Or Guess the Candidate, which is one that I was privileged enough to be present and work on. We took all the Democratic candidates for president, took some of their speeches, and we just played with race and gender, swapping them around, and then presented to people via an online portal and said, can you guess who this candidate is, based purely off their policy. But then also Joe, I missed this part, but Joe then also took it to a school, and we had a sort of mock primary election to see who they were all boys, see who the boys would vote for. First checking who they vote for prior to the speeches, and then checking afterwards who they'd vote for, with them not being aware of who the candidates are that are speaking, or just seeing their physical body. So it's a research tool. It has the capacity for a research tool, but not just insofar as biases and from an audience perspective, but also as performers. Accurately embodying speech and vocal patterns can be very, very educational for the performer, discovering those patterns, the patterns of conversation, the patterns of speech, but also the break of those patterns. And when you're physically embodying that, it's all well and good to sort of watch it on screen and go, oh, there was a pause there. But when you physically embody that pause, it really jumps out to you, and so much else does. So it's a great research tool for an in-depth analysis on, political speech, any sort of speech. And then, of course, the opportunity to empower voices that haven't been empowered. And, of course, you look at the work of Anna Devere Smith, who is part of the same school of verbatim performance. She goes in great detail about empowering voices, challenging the primacy of the Queen's English on stage, and with the African American dialect, Korean dialect, why can't we bring those forward as well? So, in indigenizing, decolonising, whatever term you want to use for the concept, looking at this process, a lot of the work's done in the context of working with Joe, because he already actively thinks about a lot of the things we need to think about. So parts of the process I'm looking at are, for example, when we go into the state where we learn the lines, where when we're working with Joe, generally the first thing we ask the actor to focus on is purely on the cadence, purely on the rhythm and pattern of the speech itself. We're not really interested in trying to get that vocal quality or impersonation going. And then Joe would layer that work deeper and deeper, building up on vocal quality, etc., to reach a point of an appropriate presentation. So for me, that calls back to and makes connections to some of the practices that oral traditions uses. So for example, a chant. Chanting is very common amongst Indigenous peoples who use oral traditions as a means of, storing and memory. And but that's effectively what we're doing when we're doing that first layer of line learning, is we're doing a chant, and we're chanting along with this person's voice, which also can induce semiotic satiation, which also provides a distancing effect for the performer as well, especially when you're dealing with harsh and traumatic content. And then laying the next layer, when we get to the voice quality, I call that the song. I think that's more of just it's less of a direct connection, but also a connection to song being so important for oral traditions, and introducing the musicality. So that's in that sort of practice there. The other factors that are important are considering, I'm representing, a living Aboriginal person and having someone portray them. So part of the big question going into my projects is, how do we do that appropriately and correctly? And first and foremost, that's led by the community and the person themselves. But then other things like, generally speaking, you would anonymise the voice that you're portraying if you're using this as a research tool, but that's antithetical for me to the purpose of what we're seeking to do, in that we need to be able to see and pay respect to the original speaker, so that he'd be visible and present on stage as well. Well, this is the specific. This is the practice. So I'm a practice-based researcher. So the practice that I'm using as a sort of focal sort of testbed is creating a verbatim performance work based on the oral history from the survivors of the Chinchilla Boys' home. So when my father was taken, he was only a baby and went on a different path, but his two eldest brothers, Uncle Widdy and Uncle Barry, they were taken to Chinchilla Boys' home. So this is a direct family history for me. So it's very appropriate and very important for me. Now, at the Chinchilla Boys' home, they were referred to by number, not by name. They were victims of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and of course every problem was solved with violence. They were made to fight each other, box each other. So you can imagine what type of adult emerges from a place like that. And then you think about and connect it to the stereotype of what our black men are like. it makes a lot more sense. So I'm approaching this again as, for me, it's a revitalisation of my own oral tradition. This is my family history. So it's the most appropriate way to share this story, share these knowledge, is human to human, spirit to spirit, heart to heart. And that's why theatre is, I feel, more superior and appropriate a methodology or a practice to apply to an Indigenous setting than something like, say, video or film. Because the other aspect that's really important, and of the big 5 R's that people hear about, responsibility is a big one, and that's the responsibility for what happens to the text afterwards, because we've been victims of violence in the archive all along. The letter my grandmother signed saying that she can't care for her children, so please take them away. I don't think she could read. But that's put in the archive as a justification for colonial violence. So we're hyper aware of the damage that can cause. So I'm hyper aware of the responsibility I have to hold and protect these spoken words from these uncles and survivors going forward, potentially generations into the future. So part of that process also involves, one, documenting and understanding this process so that future generations, high schoolers, university students, can themselves engage with the text in a deep way, going through a practice of deep listening that I'm articulating as part of this process. Walkabout way, which is effectively heuristic investigation, taking care of their safety, of course, safety and care. But then that way the students will be able to deeply embody it, respect it, and there'll be conditions and law that comes along with the rights of the play to ensure that the Kinchilla Boys Home maintains control, maintains that authority, and then it doesn't become some dissected. It's not some piece for deconstruction. It's not just a play. It's ceremony and it's business. But it also provides this great opportunity for non-Indigenous people to engage in these sort of practices as well. So the objective and the result of the development process, which is where my research practice is occurring, is that we're developing what we refer to as an ethnodrama, which is a script based on a precisely transcribed script based on the spoken words of the uncle survivors themselves, community members, family members, and some of the white voices that surround us. So once we have that script developed, ready to go, and we also have an understanding of the limits of the performance that the uncles would be comfortable with, because it can be very uncomfortable for people when a non-Indigenous person portrays in a very tight verbatim way the speech patterns of an Aboriginal person. So we won't be going that far, but where we find that limit and that line, that's going to be decided by the uncles. And all of those conditions, all of that thinking, all of that process also then goes into an accompanying educational guide. So it's an educational and directorial guide that will come with the rights to the play, and they're expected to be adhered to. But what that offers, and collectively, it offers a resource for educators to engage in a really challenging part of our history here in Australia, but with non-Indigenous students, okay? By doing this process with the uncles, we're also creating permission for, 20 years' time, a 15-year-old white girl at a private school in Melbourne can sit in the process of deep listening with my Uncle Whitty and speak his words as he spoke them to the original performer, and enter into the deep empathetic relation that happens when you embody somebody. Like any performer knows, if you've played a character, that character tends to stick with you. Well, the advantage is we're in a unique space working with the Kinchilla Boys Home uncles, because they started their healing journey close to 20 years ago already, and have had a lot of opportunity to sit and to talk. So it's a little bit more safer where, say, somewhere like, say, Cootamundra Girls Home, who have just sort of only more recently begun going through this process, I would never go into that space and do this sort of work. That's just not appropriate. There's too much healing to be done. But because the Kinchilla Boys Home has that infrastructure there, we can do this in a more safer way. Additionally speaking, all staff members have mental health first aid training. Whenever we have these gatherings, we have a nurse on site at all times. So the Boys Home itself already has that infrastructure to support the uncles and support them in safety. And that infrastructure then also extends to the performers, because we really do need to think about the care for the performers, being that they'll be engaging with this story in a deep way for the first time. So parts of the methodology that are layered in to help support the research, because one point I argue till the cows come home is that we talk about Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. Those three things are a continuum. Philosophy and practice both merge into one. So throughout the process there's integrated both safety nets but also research tools. So the choice of ensemble, for example, was, I think of it as a relational and positional ensemble. Each ensemble member was chosen as they represent a certain positioning and a certain lens on the process, and so they themselves will become co-investigators and offer insight onto some of the considerations and challenges that future teachers or educators or directors may face when working with different parts of the community, whether it's a refugee, migrant community, young man, young woman, trans person. And that becomes a positional research methodology that I based off the work of Sean Wilson. So Sean Wilson's work, Research is Ceremony, is sort of fundamental to my approach in indigenizing or decolonising the process. So everything becomes integrated. So the positional ensembles there, the use of the chant and the use of the chant again creates a distancing effect. So I've practiced this myself with example texts and artefacts, both from family members who I'm connected with, but also people like, say, Lang Hancock talking about doping the water supply so that half-castes breed themselves out. Very, very challenging piece of text to work. But as you're going through the chant, that meaning, that attack sort of just fades away and disconnects, and all you're left with is just what's being spoken, what sounds are being made, when do speech patterns break. So there's a distancing mechanic there that allows and facilitates a little bit more safety in that process for the performers themselves, as well as all the usual things, active debriefing, etc., etc. The other factor in the methodology that I think is really important when working with community is that I made my intentions known. I was going to create a play with the uncles probably close to 6 or 7 years ago, and in that time I just would go to every event that was happening on, just to sit with everyone, just to be with everyone, because even though I'm family, I still need to do that work building that relationship that every researcher has to do in an Indigenous community. The other thing I did was I created a mini version of the play that I'm going to create, and I put that on in the theatre up there in Kempsey with staff members being the speakers. And the reason I did that is because I have a real problem with the ethics of artists, particularly say in the theatre making crowd, wanting to go into a community, make a theatre piece with the community, but the community has no context of what theatre is, what the art form is. They're not necessarily familiar with it. You need to make that familiarity. And the other thing that's laid in there is part of the process as we work in devising is we're also going to be educating the uncles and the survivors about what theatre is and how they make it, so that I can absolutely maximise the agency that the survivors have within the creative process, so it genuinely becomes their work. And I argue that's the only appropriate way. I know capitalism doesn't always allow us to spend the amount of time that it takes, but that's what I guess I'm here to argue for, yeah. Yeah, so I guess it sort of it comes back to Wilson, and Wilson has these wonderful. He has the Indigenous stages of Indigenous research coming from when we were objects of study through to an assimilationist phase where Indigenous researchers in the academy would just try to fit in and do that. That's where a lot of our old fellas are now that work in primarily in education in the academy, but then always. Then going on and leading towards decolonisation and articulating our own Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies. That's what really excites me, is looking at people who are asking the question of who is an Indigenous researcher? How are we? How do we conduct ourselves as Indigenous researchers? And particularly I'm fascinated and excited with people that are working and putting that into practice, because textuality is not something that our researchers ever used before and ever needed. Granted, that's what we use today, but I've seen and I've experienced it myself, and I've made mistakes myself, back when I was doing honours, in that you can read all this wonderful information about how to work in Indigenous communities, how to research appropriately, here's the guidelines, that's great, and then have no sense of how to actually apply it in practicality. The simple functional requirements of, get a lap mic instead of having all your sound equipments, because that influences the yarn, that influences the agency. So yeah, what I'm excited about is, more and more black fellas really having the opportunity to speak in their voice, in dissertations, in research, having the capacity to challenge aspects of the academy as well, because in a way, textuality is also a gatekeeping system. There are people out there who are beautifully intelligent. There are elders who could tell you what would happen to an entire landscape if you removed one insect, but they'll never write an essay. And for so long we've been diminishing that knowledge because it doesn't come with this sort of textual credential, which I kind of find it hilarious now with ChatGPT coming out, everyone panicking that people are going to we might have to do oral examinations again. It's like, good, because that's more of a test of knowledge than sending you away to really construct and craft your argument rather than just being able to speak to it. So insofar as the academy goes, like I said, people like Wilson, I rave about, obviously Linda, Dwayne Smith, everyone that's working in decolonising and challenging the primacy of the Western system, the primacy of structuralism, post-structuralism. But that's why I really like Wilson's work above all, because he goes about saying, look, here's our relational epistemology. As long as you have that philosophical framework underneath, and it's underneath all of your practice, whether it's research, artistic, doesn't matter. If you're holding that philosophical framework, then it doesn't matter what methodology you choose, because it'll either be in alignment with that or in harmony with that, or it won't be, and then you won't use it. As opposed to going into deep dives in methodologies and trying to pull out those underlying belief structures. Just take this philosophy, this basic philosophical framework that I'm articulating through the framing of the ancestor, and then look at whatever methodologies around you and choose what you want to use, choose what you want to work. I mean, I like to always say, Pemulwuy used a gun. He didn't turn around and look at it and say, well, I won't do that, that's not appropriate. You use whatever tools available to you that supports and serves your work. And if you're holding that philosophy, then that's also going to be supporting and serving the Indigenous research agenda of the particular community that you're working with as well, because it's all encoded and built into those philosophies. Well, we're empowering voices in the academy that weren't. So that can only serve as a good thing, but also really understanding the responsibility and the potential for violence in the archive, because one beautifully well-intentioned researcher might have gone to the top end, say, and done a wonderful paper around the concerns we face with alcohol abuse, but then that paper that gets taken by a politician and they start an intervention. So it's really that awareness of the responsibility we have, because when we have an oral tradition, we always have that context. We always have the teacher that gives us that knowledge. And that knowledge is gate-kept by the elders to the point where the young person is ready to receive it. But when you don't have text and someone's sitting down to you to share knowledge, then that becomes a place of reverence. You really understand why we did do deep listening, because it's so important to hold that, because we had no other way to hold it. But because it comes with that context, it means that it's always going to be safe, because there's a person to give the context around the knowledge. But with text, it can be contextualised left and right. That's something I really hope that the work that's happening will shift our considerations around that a little bit. And my goal, like my overarching goal for me going forward, is I want to Indigenise everyone, because the planet's dying and we're all Indigenous to somewhere on it, right? But if we don't start adopting these underlying philosophical frameworks that result in sustainability, that result in thinking about we, not I, but understanding that I is part of we, if we don't start to adopt that in both our social structures but also our economic structures, if we don't start to move back towards more organic, natural framework of living, well, I mean, the planet will be fine, but we won't.